I'd always thought of my life with Emily as a quiet masterpiece, a canvas painted with steady strokes of trust and routine. We'd been married 12 years, living in a modest brick house on the edge of Portland, Oregon. I'm Jacob, 42, an architect who designs functional spaces for a living, nothing flashy, just solid. Emily's a librarian, 39, with a soft voice and a habit of humming when she thinks no one's listening. Our daughter, Mia, is 10, a whirlwind of curiosity who keeps us grounded. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours until I found the first crack. It started with a phone call I wasn't meant to hear. I'd come home early from a site visit, my boots still dusted with concrete, when I caught Emily's voice drifting from the kitchen. She was on her cell, pacing, her tone low and hurried. "No, he's not here yet. I'll figure it out. Just don't push me." I froze in the hallway, keys dangling in my hand. She didn't see me, didn't hear the creak of the floorboard. When she hung up, she spun around, her face paling as our eyes met. "Jacob," she stammered. "You're early." I asked who she was talking to. "Just a colleague," she said, too quickly, brushing past me to start dinner. Her hands trembled as she chopped carrots, and I let it go. But the seed was planted. That night I couldn't sleep. Emily's breathing was even beside me, but her phone glowed faintly on the nightstand. I'd never been the type to snoop. Trust was our unspoken pact. But something gnawed at me. I slipped out of bed, took her phone to the bathroom, and cracked her passcode. Mia's birthday. The call log showed a number she'd dialed 3 times that week, always when I was at work. No name, just digits. I Googled it later on my laptop. A burner phone, untraceable. My stomach twisted. Emily wasn't a liar, or so I'd thought. The next day, I played detective. I called in sick, parked my truck a block from the library, and watched her through the glass doors. She emerged at noon, not alone. A man, tall, wiry, with a mop of dark hair, met her at the curb. They didn't touch, but their familiarity was a punch to my chest. He handed her a coffee, and she smiled in a way I hadn't seen in months. I followed them in my truck, keeping my distance, as they drove to a diner on the outskirts of town. Through the window, I saw her laugh, her hand brushing his arm. My knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. This wasn't a colleague. This was something else. I didn't confront her that night. Couldn't. Mia was at the table, chattering about her science project, and Emily moved through our routine like nothing had shifted. She kissed my cheek before bed, her lips cool and perfunctory. I lay awake, replaying the diner scene. The way her eyes lit up for him, the ease in her posture. I'd built my life around her, and now I was an outsider peering into it. The man's face haunted me. I didn't know him, but I needed to, so I dug deeper. I started with her laptop, left open on the kitchen counter while she showered. Her email was clean, too clean, like she'd scrubbed it, but her browser history wasn't. She'd been searching for weekend getaways and discreet messaging apps. My pulse hammered. I cross-checked the dates. 2 weeks ago, she told me she was visiting her sister in Seattle. I called her there, heard the rain in the background, or what I'd assumed was rain. Now I wondered. I pulled up our bank records online. A hotel charge? $189. From a place an hour south of Portland. No sister lived there. I tracked the man next. I'd snapped a blurry photo of him at the diner with my phone, zoomed in on his license plate as he drove off. A friend at the DMV owed me a favor. Off the books, he traced it. Daniel Kessler, 35, a freelance photographer with an apartment downtown. His Instagram was public, littered with moody landscapes and cryptic captions. Then I saw it. A photo from 3 weeks back. A woman's silhouette against a sunset. The curve of her jaw, the tilt of her head. It was Emily. No face, no name, but I knew. My wife was his muse. I stewed for days, watching her every move. She'd leave for book club or errands, and I'd tail her, a ghost in my own marriage. She met Daniel twice more, once at a park, once at his place. They were careful, never lingering in public, but I saw the glances, the way she leaned into him. My mind spun with questions. How long? Why him? I wasn't enough, fine, I could swallow that. But the betrayal wasn't just emotional. I found proof in her purse one night. A receipt for lingerie I'd never seen, dated a month ago. She wasn't wearing it for me. The realization hit like a slow bleed. Emily wasn't just stepping out. She was living a double life, and I was the fool financing it. I started piecing together the how. Daniel wasn't random. He'd done a shoot at the library last year for a local magazine. I remembered her mentioning him, casual as anything, while we ate dinner. He's talented, she'd said, fork hovering over her plate. I hadn't thought twice. Now I saw it. The spark had ignited then, smoldering under my nose. I needed more than suspicion. I bought a voice recorder, small enough to hide in her car under the passenger seat. 2 days later, I retrieved it. The audio was patchy, but her voice cut through, laughing, teasing. "You're terrible," she said, and Daniel's low chuckle followed. "Only for you." Then silence, rustling, a sigh I knew too well. My hands shook as I listened, parked in an empty lot miles from home. They'd stopped somewhere, his place probably, and the recorder caught fragments of intimacy I couldn't unhear. I shut it off before it ended, bile rising in my throat. I confronted her that night. Mia was at a sleepover, and the house felt too big, too quiet. Emily was folding laundry when I dropped the recorder on the table. "Explain this," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside. She froze, eyes darting to the device. "Jacob, what? Don't." I cut her off. "I followed you. I know about Daniel." Her face crumpled, but she didn't deny it. "It's not what you think," she whispered. I laughed, bitter and hollow. "You're sneaking around with him, buying things I'll never see. What is it, then?" She sank into a chair, hands twisting in her lap. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did." She talked about feeling invisible, how Daniel saw her in ways I hadn't. I listened, numb, as she painted herself the victim. "I still love you," she said finally. I stared at her, the woman I'd vowed to protect, and felt nothing but rage. "You don't get to say that," I told her, walking out before I broke something. Sleep stopped coming after that. I moved to the guest room, a purgatory of creaky springs and silence. Emily tried to bridge the gap. Notes on the counter, soft knocks on the door, but I shut her out. My mind churned with what I'd heard, what I'd seen. Daniel wasn't just a fling. He was her escape, and I was the anchor she resented. But the worst part? She didn't stop. I checked her phone again, found texts to him. "He knows, but I can't let you go." She was choosing him even now. I started planning. Revenge wasn't my nature. I build things, not destroy them, but this demanded something. I dug into Daniel's life. His photography gigs were sporadic, his rent paid late half the time. He had a DUI from 3 years back, a temper in the courtroom records. Vulnerable. I could use that. Emily, though, she was the heart of it. She'd humiliated me, shredded our vows, and I wanted her to feel it back tenfold. I hired a private investigator, a grizzled guy named Paul who smelled like stale coffee. "Give me everything," I told him. "Where they go, what they do, who they are when they're not pretending." Paul delivered a week later. Photos of them at a motel, her car parked outside his apartment overnight, even a shot of her slipping him cash. My cash, I realized, checking our joint account. She was funding their little fantasy. The PI smirked as he handed me the file. "You've got options, pal." Options. I mulled them over, each darker than the last. I could expose her to Mia, ruin her perfect mom facade. I could drain the account, leave her scrambling. But those felt petty, fleeting. I needed something that lasted, something that carved into her soul the way she'd carved into mine. Then it hit me, not just her, but him too. They'd built this together. They'd fall together. I started sketching the edges of a plan, precise as any blueprint I'd ever drawn. The plan crystallized over coffee one gray morning, the house silent with Mia at school and Emily at work, or wherever she claimed to be. I stopped asking. I sat at the kitchen table, Paul's photos spread out like a crime scene, and saw the thread that tied them: their arrogance. They thought I was blind, weak, a prop in their story. I proved them wrong. My revenge wouldn't be loud or messy. It'd be surgical, a collapse they'd never see coming. First, I secured Mia. I called my sister in Boise, arranged for Mia to spend the summer there under the guise of family time. Emily agreed, oblivious, probably relieved to have me distracted. With Mia safe, I turned to Daniel. His DUI was my lever. I found the arresting officer, now retired, through a mutual contact. Over beers he spilled. Daniel had mouthed off, nearly swung at him. Guy's got a short fuse, he said. Perfect. I paid a hacker friend to dig into Daniel's digital footprint, emails, bank records, anything. Jackpot. He'd been dodging taxes on unreported gig income. A quiet tip to the IRS would bury him in audits for years. Emily was trickier. She thrived on her image. Devoted wife, gentle librarian. I'd stripped that bare. I remembered her sister's visit last year, how Emily had bragged about her stable life, while I nodded along. Her sister's number was still in my phone. I called, casual, and planted seeds. Emily's been distant, secretive. I'm worried. Her sister pressed. I stayed vague. Let her imagination run. Soon, whispers would spread, family, friends, coworkers. Emily hated scrutiny. It'd eat at her. The final piece was their bond. I turned it toxic. I forged a letter from Daniel, sloppy handwriting and all, confessing he'd used her, that she was just a game. I'd plant it in her car, let her find it after I'd tipped him off about her clinging. They'd unravel each other, mistrust festering like rot. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. This wasn't enough yet. It needed a sharper edge. But the framework was there, and I felt the first flicker of control since this began. The days blurred into a haze of quiet plotting. Mia was gone, safely tucked away in Boise with my sister, her laughter echoing through occasional phone calls that kept me sane. The house felt hollow without her, a shell where Emily and I circled each other like strangers. She'd stopped apologizing, stopped trying to mend the rift. Instead, she wore a mask of normalcy, cooking dinner, folding towels, while her eyes darted to her phone every few minutes. I knew who she was texting. I let her think I'd given up, that I was broken and beaten. It made her careless. Paul, the PI, became my shadow. He tailed Daniel, feeding me updates. The guy was cocky, strutting around like he'd won something. Paul caught him selling prints at a local gallery, pocketing cash under the table. More ammo for the IRS tip, which I filed anonymously through a burner email. I pictured Daniel sweating as letters piled up, his smug grin fading. But that was just the appetizer. I needed him rattled, off balance, so I fed his paranoia. I had Paul leave a vague note on his windshield. I know what you're doing. Unsigned, untraceable. Let him squirm, wondering who was watching. Emily's unraveling started with her sister. The phone call had worked better than I'd hoped. Within days, her sister texted me, fishing for details. She's acting strange with me too, she wrote. I played dumb, dropped hints about someone else. Gossip spread like wildfire. Her parents called her probing. Her book club friends grew distant. I saw it in her face at home. The strain, the way she flinched when her phone rang. She thought she could hide behind her perfect little life, but I was dismantling it brick by brick. The forged letter was next. I spent an hour perfecting Daniel's messy scrawl, copying it from a signature Paul had snagged off a receipt. You're too much, clingy, needy. I needed a break, not a leash. It was fun, but I'm done. Cruel, cutting, just his style. I slipped it into her car, tucked under the visor where she'd find it after work. Then I texted him from a throwaway number, mimicking her tone. Why are you pulling away? I deserve better. I watched from the library parking lot as she climbed in, saw her hands freeze as she read it. Her shoulders shook. Anger, tears, I couldn't tell. Good. Let it fester. Emily came home that night a wreck. Her eyes were red, her voice sharp as she slammed her bag on the counter. Everything okay? I asked, feigning concern over my coffee. She glared, lips tight. Fine, she snapped, storming upstairs. I heard the shower run for an hour, a wall of sound to drown her thoughts. Downstairs, I smiled into the dark. The letter had landed, and Daniel's reply to her text, Paul intercepted it, was a curt, "Back off, I need space." Their little paradise was cracking, and I hadn't even raised my voice. I turned up the heat. Daniel's temper was my next target. I knew his haunts, Paul had mapped them, and I staged a scene. I paid a guy, a burly ex-con with a knack for provocation, to pick a fight at Daniel's favorite bar. Nothing physical, just words. "Heard you're a leech, Kessler, living off married women." Daniel swung, missed, got tossed out. The bartender banned him, and word spread, his ego took the hit I'd aimed for. He'd blame her, I figured, for dragging him into my orbit. I was right. Paul caught him yelling into his phone the next day, "Your husband's psycho, Emily? Call him off." She denied it, of course, but the seed was there. Her family tightened the noose. Her sister showed up unannounced, cornering her in the living room while I worked in the garage. I listened through the cracked door as she pressed, "Mom's worried." "I'm worried, what's going on?" Emily stammered, deflecting, but her sister wasn't buying it. "If you're hiding something, it'll come out," she warned, leaving Emily pale and pacing. I stepped in later, casual as ever. "Everything all right with your sister?" She nodded, too fast, and I knew she was drowning in the scrutiny. I checked our accounts that night. She'd withdrawn $300, probably for him again. I froze the joint account, rerouted my paycheck to a new one she couldn't touch. When she noticed, she'd panic, but I'd play dumb. "Bank error. I'll fix it." She'd have to ask him for help, lean on his shaky finances. I wanted her dependent, cornered, watching her options vanish. The blueprint was taking shape, each move locking them tighter in my trap. The fallout was beautiful chaos. Emily confronted me about the account 2 days later, her voice shrill as she waved her phone. "Why can't I access it, Jacob?" I shrugged, stirring my oatmeal. "Glitch, probably. I'll call tomorrow." She didn't believe me, but she couldn't prove it. Her hands shook as she dialed the bank. Got nowhere. I'd already warned them. Identity theft concerns, temporary freeze. She stormed out, likely to Daniel, who'd be no help with his own mess brewing. The IRS had sent their first letter. Paul saw him shredding it in a panic. I pushed harder. I leaked a rumor through a coworker's wife, a library regular. Heard Emily's been distracted, sneaking off during shifts. It hit the staff room, then her boss. She got a warning, nothing formal, just a quiet focus up. Her perfect image frayed, and she came home ranting about gossips. I nodded, sympathetic, while texting Paul for updates. Daniel was spiraling too. His gallery pulled his work after the bar fight, citing reputation. He blamed her, I learned from a tapped call Paul rigged. "Your drama's tanking me," he snarled. She cried, begged him to stay calm. He hung up. Her friends turned next. I'd mailed anonymous notes, typed, "No fingerprints," to her book club, hinting at secrets and double lives. Nothing concrete, just enough to stir doubt. 2 dropped out, citing scheduling. The rest iced her out. She stopped going, claiming she was too busy. I saw the loneliness creep in, the way she lingered by the window, waiting for something to fix itself. It wouldn't. I'd made sure of that. The cruelest touch was Mia's absence. Emily called her daily, but I'd coached my sister. Keep it short, vague. "She's having fun, don't worry." Emily's voice broke each time, missing her anchor. I let her feel that void, let it mirror mine. She'd chosen this, I reminded myself, staring at Paul's latest photo. Her at Daniel's door, pleading. He'd turned her away, and she'd driven off sobbing. The trap was closing, and I felt the cold satisfaction of a builder watching his design rise. Emily cracked visibly by week's end. She barely ate, her cheeks hollowing as she drifted through the house. I kept my distance, observing, letting her stew. She tried Daniel again. Paul saw her bang on his door, shouting, but he changed the locks. The letter, the texts, the fight. He thought she'd betrayed him, and she thought he'd abandoned her. I'd orchestrated their implosion, and it was poetry. She came home that night, hair wild, and collapsed on the couch, staring at nothing. I offered her tea. She ignored me. I struck deeper. I'd found an old journal of hers, tucked in the attic, dreams, fears, confessions from years back. She'd written about wanting more, feeling trapped. I scanned it, sent snippets to her parents, and signed, "She's been lying to you." They called her, furious, demanding answers. She screamed into the phone, "It's not true." But the damage was done. Her mother's voice, icy through the receiver, cut her off. "We raised you better." Emily threw the phone, shattering it. I swept up the pieces later, silent. Daniel's ruin accelerated. The IRS froze his accounts, and a client sued him for missed deadlines. My hacker friend had nudged their inbox with complaints. He lost his apartment, crashing with a friend who barely tolerated him. Paul caught him ranting on a street corner, unshaven, unraveling. I smiled at the photo, knowing Emily would hear soon. She did, through a mutual acquaintance, and called him desperate. He cursed her out, hung up. She sat in the dark after, muttering to herself. I watched from the hall, unseen. I tightened the vise. I filed for separation, had papers drafted but not served, yet. I let her find the draft by accident on my desk. She read it, hands trembling, and looked at me with hollow eyes. "Jacob, please," she whispered. I said nothing, walked away. She didn't sleep that night. I heard her pacing. The endgame was near, and I savored the weight of it, the justice of her collapse. The final act loomed, and I refined it with precision. Emily was a ghost now. Job on the line, family estranged, lover gone. I'd stripped her world bare, but the revenge needed a capstone, something unforgettable. I thought of her pride, her need to be seen as good. I'd shatter that last illusion. I contacted a local reporter, a hungry kid chasing scoops. I fed him a story. Anonymous tip, grainy photos from Paul. Librarian's secret life implodes. No names, just enough for locals to connect dots. It ran online, vague but damning. Whispers hit the library, her boss called her in. She came home fired, sobbing into her hands. "They said I'm a liability," she choked out. I nodded, neutral, pouring coffee. Her co-workers had turned, her sanctuary lost. She had nothing left but me, and I'd make sure that burned too. I staged the last blow. A package delivered to her. From Daniel. Inside, a cheap necklace she'd worn for him. Paul had swiped it, wrapped in a note. "You were never worth it." She clutched it, wailing, as I watched from the stairs. She didn't know I'd sent it, didn't suspect. Daniel hit bottom that week. Evicted, broke, he pawned his camera. Paul tailed him, grinning in the update. I tipped off his ex-clients. They blacklisted him. He'd never climb back. Emily heard through the grapevine, called me from the kitchen, voice raw. "He's gone, Jacob. It's over." I looked at her, saw the wreck she'd become, and felt the cold triumph settle. "You chose this," I said, leaving her there. The papers were served the next day. She signed, defeated, no fight left. I'd won, her life in ruins, his too, a paired collapse of my design. I packed a bag, left the house to her hollow shell, and drove off, the weight lifting. Revenge wasn't joy, but it was balance, and I'd built it perfectly. The ink on the separation papers was barely dry when I left the house for good. I'd rented a small apartment across town, a bare space with white walls and a single window overlooking a parking lot. It wasn't home, but it was mine, free of Emily's shadow. I'd taken what mattered. My clothes, my tools, a photo of Mia from her 5th birthday. Emily got the wreckage. Our house, her guilt, the echoes of a life she'd torched. I didn't look back as I drove away, her silhouette shrinking in the rearview mirror. She called me that night, voice ragged through the static. "Jacob, we can fix this. Please come back." I let her words hang, then said, "You fixed it already," and hung up. She'd lost everything. Her job, her lover, her family's trust, and now me. I'd made sure of it. Paul sent a final update. She'd been seen at the library, begging for her position back. They turned her away. The article I'd leaked had spread, a quiet scandal that clung to her like damp rot. She was a pariah, and I felt the first real breath of freedom in months. Daniel's collapse was complete too. Paul tracked him to a dive bar, where he'd been crashing on a friend's couch until the friend kicked him out. The IRS had seized what little he had left. His car, his gear, and the lawsuit buried him in debt. I'd heard he'd tried calling Emily, leaving slurred voicemails she didn't answer. Their bridge was ash and I'd lit the match. I pictured him alone, unshaven, nursing a cheap beer, and felt a grim satisfaction. He'd taken what was mine. I'd taken everything from him. I wasn't done, though. Emily's suffering needed one last twist, a signature on my design. I'd kept a card up my sleeve, her journal, the one I'd used against her family. It wasn't just leverage, it was a weapon. I photocopied pages, the raw ones where she'd written about resenting me, dreaming of escape. I mailed them to her closest friend, Lisa, with a note. "She's not who you think." Lisa had stood by her longest, but this would break that thread. Emily's isolation would be absolute, a cage of her own making. Lisa's response was swift. Paul saw her confront Emily at a coffee shop, her voice rising as she waved the pages. "How could you?" she shouted, loud enough for heads to turn. Emily shrank, stammering excuses, but Lisa walked out, leaving her alone at the table. I got the report over breakfast, smirking into my eggs. Emily had no one left, no family, no friends, no Daniel. She'd built her world on lies, and I'd stripped it bare, brick by brick, until she stood in the rubble. I visited Mia that weekend in Boise. She ran to me, all hugs and giggles, oblivious to the storm I'd unleashed. My sister raised an eyebrow as we talked later, sensing the edge in my voice. "You okay, Jake?" she asked. I nodded, sipping her too-strong coffee. "Better than I've been." I didn't tell her the details, didn't need to. Mia was safe, happy, and that was enough. I'd tell her about the separation later, when the dust settled. For now, I let her chatter about school, soaking in her light. Back in Portland, I heard Emily had moved. A neighbor texted me. She'd packed a few bags, left the house dark, and vanished. I drove by to confirm. The windows were blank, the lawn overgrown. She'd run, probably to her parents, hoping for mercy. They wouldn't give it. I'd made sure they saw her as a stranger. I walked the empty rooms, tracing the life we'd had. Her perfume lingered, faint and sour. I locked the door behind me, done with ghosts. Daniel surfaced too, briefly. Paul spotted him at a shelter, gaunt and muttering, his camera long gone. I crushed him, not with fists, but with precision. He'd never work again, never charm his way out. I sent Paul a bonus, told him to close the file. The revenge was complete, but I felt a hollow ache. Not regret, something else. I'd won, yet the victory was cold. A blueprint executed without flaw but no warmth in the structure. Weeks passed, and the silence grew heavy. I threw myself into work, designing warehouses and offices, losing hours in straight lines and load-bearing walls. Colleagues noticed my focus, mistook it for healing. I let them. At night, I'd sit by my window, watching cars crawl through the lot, replaying every move I'd made. Emily's face haunted me. Not the broken one, but the one I'd loved, humming in the kitchen years ago. I'd destroyed her, and it was right, but it left a scar. Then she called again. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. "Jacob," she whispered, voice thin as paper. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I heard wind in the background, a distant train. "Where are you?" I asked, neutral. She hesitated. "A motel. I don't know what to do." I pictured her, alone in some dim room, clutching a cracked phone. "You made your choices," I said, and ended the call. She didn't try again. I tracked her anyway, habit, maybe. A quick call to her sister, feigning concern, got me the truth. Emily was in Salem, crashing at a cheap place off the highway. Her parents had taken her in briefly, then sent her packing. "She's a mess," her sister said, voice flat. I thanked her, hung up, and stared at the wall. She'd fallen further than I'd planned, a bonus I hadn't drawn into the blueprint. Should have felt good. Didn't. Daniel's end came quieter. A contact at the shelter said he'd vanished. Skipped town, maybe, or worse. No one cared enough to look. I'd erased him, a footnote in my revenge. I toasted him with a beer one night, alone in my apartment, the taste bitter on my tongue. They'd both paid, more than I'd imagined, and I was left standing, the architect of their ruin, unbowed but unmoored, wondering what came next. Spring crept in, softening the air, and I started rebuilding. Mia came back from Boise, her energy filling my apartment with noise and color. I told her the truth, gently over ice cream. "Mom and I aren't together anymore," I said, watching her spoon pause. She nodded, eyes big, then asked, "Can I still see her?" I said yes, of course, hiding the twist in my gut. Emily didn't deserve Mia, but I wouldn't take that from my girl. We'd figure it out. I heard from Emily's sister again, unprompted. "She's working now," she said. "Some diner job, barely scraping by." I pictured her in a stained apron, hair pulled back, serving strangers with that hollow look. It fit penance in grease and minimum wage. I thanked her sister, kept it short. Mia saw her once, came back quiet. "Mom looks sad," she said, curling into me on the couch. I hugged her, said nothing. Sadness was Emily's currency now. I'd spent mine on justice. The house sold, finally. I'd listed it after she left, split the profit down the middle as the papers demanded. She got her half, enough to survive, not thrive. I used mine to buy a fixer-upper near Mia's school, a project to keep my hands busy. I tore out walls, laid new floors, built something solid. It was therapy, erasing the past with every nail. Neighbors asked about my wife. I smiled, said, "Just me and my daughter," and left it there. I stopped tracking Daniel. He was gone, a phantom I'd banished. Rumors said he'd hitchhiked east, chasing nothing. I didn't care. My revenge had consumed him, and that was enough. Nights grew easier, the ache dulling as Mia's laughter filled the gaps. I'd won. Not just over them, but over the chaos they'd sown. The structure held, and I stood in it, steady, ready for whatever came next. A year later, I saw Emily by chance. I was at a hardware store, grabbing paint for Mia's room, when she appeared at the register. She didn't see me at first, thinner, hair dull, scanning items with mechanical precision. Our eyes met as I stepped up, and she froze, hands hovering over my can. "Jacob," she breathed, like my name was a ghost. I nodded, polite, distant. "How's Mia?" she asked, voice cracking. "Good," I said. "Happy." She swallowed, looked away, and I paid, left without another word. Driving home, I replayed it. She'd aged a decade in a year, hollowed out by the life I'd engineered. No family, no friends, no pride, just a barcode scanner and a rented room. I'd wanted her to feel my pain, and she did, magnified. Daniel was a memory, a casualty of my design, and she was the last pillar standing, barely. I'd built their ruin with care, a cruel symmetry, and it held firm. Mia asked about her that night, brushing her teeth. "Can Mom visit sometime?" I paused, toothbrush in hand. "If she wants to," I said, meaning it. Emily hadn't reached out since Salem, hadn't fought for Mia. I wouldn't block her, but I wouldn't chase her either. Mia nodded, spat, and hugged me goodnight. Her trust was my anchor, the one thing they couldn't touch. I finished the house that summer, new paint, new life. Friends came over, filled it with noise, and I felt the past loosen its grip. Emily and Daniel were shadows, fading in the rearview. I'd torn them down, rebuilt myself, and stood taller for it. Revenge wasn't sweet. It was cold, deliberate, a structure I'd mastered. And now, with Mia's hand in mine, I walked forward, the architect of my own peace, the wreckage behind me.